This is Dark Sector, released in 2013 by Digital Extremes, known for Unreal Tournament 2004 and Unreal Tournament Chit. Coming off of the success of helping develop Unreal Tournament, Digital Extremes looked to branch out in the AAA gaming market. After starting development in 2001, and with the help of D3 Publisher, Dark Sector was released in 2008 for the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC. It was also the first step of then game director, now CEO of Digital Extremes, Steve Sinclair, who is nowadays known for his work on Warframe and the upcoming Soulframe. Like probably many Warframe players, I first heard of Dark Sector because of how many references Warframe has to it, and in turn, decided to give it a go. Lucky for me, not too long ago, Digital Extremes gave it away for free on Steam with the promotion of Warframe 1999. While the game has thankfully been preserved on Steam, it's pretty infamous for being a little jank to get running properly. I didn't have too many technical difficulties relating on the game, although most in the comment section that talk about the game seem to imply it might have a few underlying issues. The biggest one you'll most likely encounter is with your HUD not fitting the resolution of your monitor if you set the game to 1920 by 1080. To fix this, go into the game folder, open up this config, and copy-paste this from a Steam guide. With that, you'll be able to see your ammo count normally. Apart from that, the only real issue I would have is sometimes the game would forget my audio settings. Also, don't try alt-tabbing, the game will absolutely lose its shit if you do. Without further ado, let's get into the game. Cryptic. We're thrown into the game with a 2000s action game neck snap, where we're introduced to our protagonist, Hayden Tenno. He's here as a CIA agent looking to prevent the spread of some kind of virus and find high-priority target called Victor Sudek. After finding him and getting the information for where our real target is, Robert Mesner, Hayden gives him JFK's last haircut. This game takes place in the fictional Eastern Bloc country of Lazria post-Cold War. Currently, there's been some form of an outbreak of an infection called the technocyte virus. Your typical make people go crazy violent, infects on a scratch or bite type virus. Hayden is ambushed by a helicopter which he takes out with a rocket launcher, before he's ambushed by a strange infected woman with a giant twin blade. Alpha Nix here blows him up by reflecting his own rocket, leading to him being ambushed by Mesner.
But they said the same of you, didn't they? Unstable, psychotic, unfit for duty, and yet they still sent you, in spite of the fact that you are so broken. But I can fix you. Do it.
Wait! Wait!
You know of the lotus, prized as a refuge, and yet it blooms amidst still and decay. Of course you die in the process, but I think you, of all people, deserve it.
Maybe I do.
Hayden is now infected and stranded without his gear. Mesner is most likely still alive alongside the Nemesis. AD tells us to meet up with our contact, Yargo Menzik, to get boosters to fight the infection. In the meantime, improvise to get through. The infection takes that matter into its own hands, and as Hayden is ambushed by a guard, It forms a glaive, Dark Sector's big selling point and a staple of your arsenal. With the introduction to the glaive, now's a good time to talk about gameplay. Dark Sector is a third-person cover shooter, and in turn, plays very much like a 7th generation cover shooter. Take cover, dodge, and sprint are all bound to control by default, and by tapping the key, you can take cover behind objects the game deems interactable. The game is a little weird about what it considers cover compared to what it doesn't, which can add to some strange frustration in combat when it looks like you take cover behind something, the game doesn't recognize that surface is available to take cover behind. Like many games in the 7th generation, you have regenerating health, no health bar, with your only indication for how low you are on health being how red your screen gets. It's pretty standard for the genre, and honestly, I think the game's cover shooter mechanics benefit from having the player having regenerating health. That being said, to label Dark Sector as just a cover shooter takes away from a lot of the nuance from the combat. After the prologue, you're more likely to be relying on your glaive more than anything. The glaive by base lets you chop up enemies and open them up for finishers, like a more portable Half-Life saw blade. It really gets moving once you gain the ability to perform super throws that deal quadruple damage. You also get the ability to control the glaive eventually. It's a bit gimmicky, but it's useful for clearing out hard to reach enemies. Glaive can also be used to pick up interactables like mods, ammos, or guns. Since Hayden's infected, guns that he could originally pick up off of soldiers are far more limited. The military has decided to put Macy's clothes tags on all their guns to prevent the infected from picking them up and stirring some kind of World War Z revolution. In turn, it means any weapon you pick up can only be used for a few seconds before the tag goes off and it's disabled. It creates this gameplay loop where you're often scavenging guns off enemies to use them before their time limit, creating this energy where you're constantly swapping between taking out enemies with your glaive and then stealing their guns to go on rampages. Guns themselves are a mixed bag. With your glaive out, you're relegated to your pistol. In terms of starting pistols, it's got enough stopping power to clean up whatever your glaive doesn't kill, making it a good combo. However, one thing to be wary of is every gun is woefully inaccurate. The old burst fire and price strat definitely helps to mitigate it, but I think this might be the first shotgun ever to fire out its sides instead of straight at the target. You can get guns that aren't chipped from the merchant. In a very unceremonious animation, you can enter the market. Money can be found spread around levels, usually in enemy encampments. It's always good to check around and grab some before leaving an area. You can also find these suitcases that contain mods. These can also be applied at the gunsmith. They're one-time use and cannot be removed, so you have to decide on what you're going to use your limited mod space for. They can help with accuracy, reload speed, clip size, or the more fun stuff like coating your bullets in corrosive materials and making them fire 2 shots at the same time. Note that one also uses twice the ammo with each shot. There are also mods that increase your mod capacity on guns, allowing you to get an additional slot for applying mods. Overall, it's a pretty simple but effective system. It feels good to upgrade your guns, and there's just enough choices for you to consider what you want to choose for a gun. For example, with my pistol, I went with the double tap perk as I used it to finish off anything my glaive didn't kill. Meanwhile, for my AK, I gave it an extended mag and a switch. The market also lets you store weapons and buy ammo and mods you need. I never used it in my playthrough outside of testing it with the burst pistol, but it's nice to have. With the amount of money the game gives you, you'll probably end up only with 1 or 2 guns you get from the market that you stick with till the end of the game. Maybe there's room to experiment on a follow-up playthrough, but I'm not sure if there's enough variety to try experimenting. In terms of weapons, you have 2 assault rifles, 2 shotguns, a carbine, and a choice of a single-shot, burst, or full-auto pistols. There isn't really much reason to experiment unless you like the looks of a gun better. I would say the most useful gun to try out is the carbine, as it's the most accurate out of the bunch. Enemy-wise, Dark Sector keeps it simple but easy to read. The Lazarean military camped up is usually in pretty similar military attire, unless they remember it's a pandemic and then they get the hazmat suits. What's nice is that you can actually tell if a soldier is a shotgun user or not based on their hazmat color. The shotguns have a more orange-colored suit. There are also these oddly familiar shielder units who are recognizable in an instant. The infection you fight off starts as your regular kind of infected villager types, using their old tools now to fight back, to eventually becoming full-on mutants with far better shotguns than the player. I think the infection starts to affect the enemies as you keep going, as it feels the further into the game you get, the more the AI breaks. I had infected stop what they were doing and space out like they're observing the scenery. Sometimes you just see an animation and you just go, yep, that's definitely a computer-controlled enemy. The enemy soldiers don't get the random tweaking gene that the infected do, but sometimes it feels like they're struggling to react to stimuli. While there's lots of cover combat, you do have other defensive abilities. Your sprint has very low turn speed, so it's more like a dead sprint, even shoving the camera low as you run. You also have a dodge. There seems to be some iframes, so while you can't just roll through the entire game, you can dodge a few shots from rolling. Your glaive can also absorb elements, which in turn can be detonated and overall boost its damage even further. There are also grenades, but they might as well have the same impact on gameplay that Cheetos do in variety pack sales. You get some additional infected powers such as a shield and invisibility. The shield didn't feel super useful, maybe I just forgot to use it, but it does reflect back projectiles, so it's definitely not useless. The invisibility feels much more of a gimmick and seems to be better used for puzzles with automated cameras. One thing about the general combat that I dislike is a problem I noticed in several 7th generation shooters, which is the whack-a-mole syndrome. It's something you'll notice in a lot of older Call of Duties, but enemies spawn based on how much you've pushed up and do not have a set spawn. They instead have these alcove doors where they'll funnel in from, and only stop spawning once you've pushed up a certain distance. The problems this creates is in longer gunfights, the game turns into taking cover before making a few shots to kill a soldier and then seeing them respawn. It creates this loop where you have these just long, drawn-out gunfights that end up feeling very tedious. Not to say this type of enemy spawns is bad. There are examples of games that use these types of spawn to keep combat engaging. It's something even Warframe does, which fits the pace of the game. But for something like Dark Sector, it feels just more annoying and forces you to plink away at enemies with inaccurate guns until it feels somewhat safe to push up. The game also tries to do boss fights, and man, do they need work. Coming from Warframe, I already knew Digital Extreme's strong suits was not boss fights, and I really wish they'd get one right. A lot of the fights have one-hit kill attacks that feel very cheap, and there isn't really much of a visual indicator when you're doing damage. They aren't so obscure that you need a guide to beat them, but I was second guessing if I was doing anything when I was shooting them. Coupled with the limited ammo of the arenas, and oftentimes you're left with your glaive relying on for damage. Art direction is one of Dark Sector's strong suits. While the human gear looks just accurate enough to be seen as grounded at a pass and legally distinct enough when looking at it further, it's more alien tech that's really unique. It's something that transferred over into every faction in Warframe. On the Infected side, it feels like they really started to experiment with the weird body horror that's in Warframe that would later take off with its own Infested. A lot of texturing in Hayden's arm feels gross and a reminder that it's still organic. However, the metallic shell that creeps over at the end of the game makes it feel a lot more controlled and machine-like. The suit he gets later on in the game enforces that further, with it feeling very organic with its weird helmet flaps, and how it almost looks like a second layer of infected skin than a tactical suit. It's this weird mix of bioflesh and tactical holstering that gives it a human silhouette, but also keeps it feeling strange and alien. The Russian military also has a lot of weird robots and mechanical suits that carry a lot of the design language that Digital Extreme's sci-fi tech does, with machines like the Jackal having almost organic limbs and bodies, but just enough machine parts peeking out to remind you that's a robot first and foremost. The suits also look big and industrial with these heavy rounded pads, shoulders, and arms. They look like they were designed to be effective at taking a hit and mobility being an afterthought. The actual city of Lazarus certainly captures that Eastern Bloc energy, with most of the buildings look like they were designed for practicality and most decorations being simplistic and needing repair. If the story didn't mention it, just the city itself feels like the Cold War just ended with how many broken down buildings there are. Enough of the infrastructure is crumbling to get the energy that this is an active war zone for containment, but the place hasn't completely reached the point where the military is dropping bombs over the city. Graphics-wise, this is definitely on the lower end of 7th generation games, but given this was a project by a smaller studio, it still looks pretty decent. There's a good amount of detail put into Hayden himself, with light reflecting well off his tactical suit in the right places to give it that synthetic cloth look. Plus the metallic reflection on his arms are pretty well done. The lighting does a decent amount of work overall to keep it looking pretty, or as pretty as 7th generation warm lighting can be. The lighting and environment in general are pretty well done. While this is most likely because the areas stay pretty consistent as this rundown city, it's the fact that the graphics stay consistent that is impressive, given this is a studio known for mostly helping with projects. That being said, there isn't much variety to the levels you go through. The game only has 10 chapters, including the prologue, and all of it is just going through these demilitarized city streets and buildings. The game does swap it up from time to time, however, such as the level going through the city cemetery, or the one that takes us to a boat off coast. I just wish it did more with these stages instead of having them for brief set pieces. Without going into spoilers, it feels like the final stages were a lot more of the same, playing a little too close to how an actual path to the nuclear bunker would be like. The voice acting is... well, it's not the worst I've heard from a small game studio. The soldiers have this very similar generic "I'm moving" cover lines, however they do have this filter over the voice that makes it sound like they're talking through a mask. The big thing of note is that they draw from a very limited pool of death screams, and those screams are dramatic. I assume they got people from around the office just to do voice lines, but man, they really wanted to make sure they got those death screams down. While the voice acting itself isn't anything too bad, it's just very bland forms of stiffness, there is this weird audio mixing issue I encountered while playing. I'm not sure if it was my personalized issue with the game, but for some reason later cutscenes had this issue with the mixing where it sounded like characters would start another sentence before being cut off.
Yargo, you've got something for me?
I do. I have your updated orders from the AD. I have also arranged for you to acquire weapons and explosives.
I can't tell if it's trying to loop the audio or if it's trying to play the next line, but there are times where it sounds like they're about to say one thing, but the next line they say something else.
Take this to the underground. They'll give you the explosives you need. Guns too, without the governors on them. If price is right. Even as well drowns, rats will swim. I hope you won't find the sewers unpleasant.
It's such a strange issue because I'm not even sure how something like this happens. From what I can find online, the cutscenes are just like that, which, if so, what a strange problem not to fix. Music is pretty well done in Dark Sector. Like many action games, it creeps in to let you know you're in combat, usually in areas the game considers to be big shootouts. For the military, they have more traditional action music with tense drums and horns. However, for the infected fights, they were meant for a more droning sound that really radiates the horror that the infected give off. I'm going to jump into plot, and while there isn't a lot to go over, this ties in with the sections talking about its connections to Warframe. Regardless, if you want to just skip my final grading, skip to here. Alright, here we go. The military is trying to keep the infection under wraps, but it seems like they're having a hard time even doing that. Upon meeting Yargo, he gives us another booster and tells us that Messner has the infected collected in the harbor, and when Hayden detonated the explosives, he released them across the city. Turns out he was using a Soviet transmitter to round up the infected. This seems to imply that the infection has been around since the 80s. It seems that Messner plans to use the infection as a bioweapon, either sell to the highest bidder or use them to take over the world. When we reach the transmitter, we're ambushed by Nadia, who seems to have some sort of shared history with Hayden. She references something from Hayden's past and some amoral stuff he's done.
I want to hear you say it. You didn't have any orders, you acted alone.
I knew they needed to die. I knew they were sick.
For Christ's sake, Hayden, they weren't sick.
She's working with Messner for some vague reasons of justice. What it seems to imply is that Hayden has a knack for being the CIA's cleanup guy for any time a mildly threatening disease spreads. Which, I mean, we've seen him restore the bodies in a graveyard overnight. Hayden tries to cover up for Nadia given their past, before being sent to clean up the freighter carrying Messner's antibody collection for the virus. This in turn results in Hayden releasing the captured infected, who end up in turn returning back to the shore. Maybe Nadia had a point. Hayden did just release 2 batches of infected, with the second batch being worse. After making back to shore in one piece, Hayden learns that Yargo has been captured by Messner's men. AD tells Hayden to stand down, but Hayden decides it's worth getting involved to save Yargo. Most likely because Nadia is involved with interrogating him, and is discussing something about a vault where the infection was first sealed off. After killing the largest infected Hayden accidentally released, he's ambushed by Messner and Nemesis. Here's where Hayden learns the purpose of the boosters. They weren't to suppress the virus, but in fact control it. As a result, he cannot kill Messner even when he's right in front of him. However, Yargo's been lacing Hayden's supplies with Enferon. Enferon isn't really explained in the universe, but Zagas said it's the one thing that repels the infection harder than 7.62. It seems the AD is working to weaponize both Hayden and Messner to use the infection as a bioweapon for sale. Hayden decides it's the best course of action to get a new fashion and go to the vault. That's better. Before this, Nadia confronts us one last time, telling us she's too deep in and that she's on her way to open the vault with Yargo as a hostage. A few gunfights later and we're confronted by the Nemesis one last time. And surprise, it's Nadia. It's pretty obvious it's her, given she's the only other female character in-game. Although it does make me question how her arm changes in the suit given the mono-glaive hand she gets. Honestly, it just kind of feels like a twist for the sake of having a twist. There isn't much to say outside of Hayden being different when it comes to the infection. Overall, I feel like Nadia and Hayden's relationship is rushed with such vague descriptions about their background. It's kind of hard to get invested when you yourself aren't in on the history of these two. It feels like there was a bit of missing prologue for Hayden that gives more information about who he is in general. The fight also sucks, but I already talked about that before. Finally reaching the vault, AD tells us to stand down and feeds our suppressor addiction. However, at this point, Hayden has realized the CIA is up to usual CIA activities and proceeds to kill the entire medical team. AD does mention Messner made a deal, implying that they thought they could control Messner and in turn, the bioweapon. It also seems to imply they're aware of what's going on in Lasria and have been for a long time. Well, our questions are answered when we reach the bottom of the bunker. We found out what that ship from the intro was for. It was transporting a destroyed US submarine that was carrying the infection. The implications of this are not fully explored in the game, however, as Messner arrives using the infected transmitter. There's another boss fight against him before Hayden, using the power of his human hand, throws his glaive and shuts down the transmitter. After that, Yargo gives some dialogue and he leaves. Overall, it feels like there really isn't much to talk about. The story clearly had a lot more planned that wasn't implemented, that seemed that the team was either running out of time, money, or both. There was a tie-in comic made with the game that goes over what happened before the infection outbreak in Lazaria. It does a lot of world building and shows what the source of the infection is. As implied in-game, the infection was a US weapon that was planned on being used in Lazaria. It pushed the Soviets to drop a literal nuke on the city just to try to get it under control. That being said, there's still so much missing from the story, such as a lot of Hayden's background, or even what his plans were after leaving the vault outside of aura farming. So what happened? Well, the initial elevator pitch for Dark Sector was very different. Began development closer to 2000 with the idea of a science fiction universe. The universe would have been carved up by different factions which the player can decide to help or not. You would play as an operator and be sent on missions that were pieces of territory held by different factions. It was also not going to be a single player game, but instead a massively online action game in which you could be allied or be put against other players. This sound familiar? Dark Sector's initial elevator pitch just reads like what Warframe is. And from the prototype footage in the background, it's clear that a lot of the initial designs for the game would eventually be repurposed for Warframe. It's clear that this version was way too ambitious for the time, given a lot of the game was scrapped or repurposed for the Dark Sector we got. Seems also they were looking to meet the demands of games going forward, with the market shifting more towards console FPS games rather than PC MMOs. Unfortunately, a lot of information has been lost to the darkest corners of time. And from what I can find, it seems that they were pushed by their publisher to develop something that was more market appeal. Not to say there wasn't a lot of love put in the concept of Dark Sector, but it seemed like a lot of compromises were made. Things like a multiplayer mode, or a push to use more mainstream mechanics like regenerating health and cover feels like design choices made to appease the publisher. However, that's not to say everything cut never got reused, because Warframe exists. I assume due to publisher reasons not fully owning the IP for a while, DE was unable to make a direct sequel to Dark Sector. However, Warframe is very blatantly a spiritual successor to Dark Sector. There's some very obvious stuff like the direct inclusion of the glaive weapon class with the same UI and ability to use your pistol alongside it. The concept of Warframes having unique weapons tied to them returns with exalted weapons. Side note, why don't we have a glaive Warframe DE? There are also referential skins for Excalibur and Nyx, as well as skins referencing all the pistols, with the reuse of some models. Look familiar? A lot of concepts from the original also made it into Warframe, such as playing as an operator, siding with factions, and player-controlled mission nodes. Oh, for fuck's sake, they're just straight up called Dark Sectors. I could probably go for a while with every little thing in Dark Sector that somehow made it into Warframe, although I would say there are two important ones. The first one is the lotus symbol and its correlation to both games. In Dark Sector, it's used all over the place to mark points of interest. There really isn't much of a reason given to its significance, however I have a theory based on other people's thoughts as well as Messner's own words. In his own words, prized as a rare beauty, and yet it blooms amidst filth and decay. This seems to be talking about the direct reference to Hayden's nature, given he's already entering the game somewhat unfit for combat. Combined with the infection affecting Lazaria, it creates this theme of something beautiful coming out of hardship and disaster, that there is beauty that can come from even the worst of destruction. In Warframe, it's a little more focused. It directly represents the Lotus, a character who's undergone several transformations, with the final one being decided by the player. Without getting too deep into spoilers, it relates back to some of the themes that were prevalent between both of these games, in which even after tragedies and calamities that destroy the world, beauty will still find a way to rebuild from it. The bigger tie is Warframe 1999. This is where things get interesting. It takes place in another earlier timeline to Warframe's main timeline in a fictional Eastern Bloc state called Holvania, which is currently being infected by the Technocyte virus. As a group of infected survivors turned militia known as the Hex, who are infected with a form of this virus turning them into the Proto-Frames. This is all giving me deja vu. Even as a gas element called Effervon. Are we serious right now, D? Dark Sector might not be canon to Warframe. However, if Warframe's the spiritual successor, 1999 is one final love letter bringing out most of the concepts from the original Dark Sector game that it could. Just from the aesthetic alone, you can tell this was made with wanting to realize more of the initial vision that Dark Sector put out. In many ways, Dark Sector was a tech demo for what would eventually become Warframe. Not just in mechanics or art design, but just the overall spirit of the game. It was a passion project by a group of small devs, and while the final result may not have been spectacular, it's an interesting piece of gaming history from a studio that would go on to create one of the longest running games that's still going strong to this day. I do wish we got to see a lot more from the initial IP of Dark Sector. There was a lot of unexplored from the original game that could have been explored in the sequel or with more time. That being said, I think what comes after Dark Sector carried its legacy far further while also maintaining so many of the concepts the original created. If you can pick it up when it's on sale, or picked it up when it was free, give it a go. It's a pretty short game, clocking in around 7 hours long. It has issues, but it's still a pretty enjoyable 7th generation cover shooter. I especially recommend trying it if you're a Warframe fan. I mentioned it originally, but there are so many little pieces that clearly went into the design of Warframe. That'll cover it for now. Join me next time as I talk about an overseas game that came from a relatively new country to the video game market.